like Bates Pro-Ams or North American Novice earlier this year. I think these are tournaments that hadn't existed before and have been really great in terms of being able to develop the community. I think tournaments like NAUDC specifically are especially important traditions where debaters from two truly excellent circuits that don't too often get to interact with each other get to debate against one another, and I think that's quite lovely. That being said, panelists, if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the order that you are on the ballot, that'd be great. Aditya?
Just give it a moment to load.
Okay.
Can someone let me know when I should begin then?
Yeah, I will. Okay, the stream is back up.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. What does this look like? One, I think it includes almost everything intended for public consumption. That is, it's going to include political writings, novels, but probably not text to your friends for obvious reasons. That is, things that you intend to be communicated to an audience of people you don't know. Two, I think this is also going to be anonymous from the government. Three, I think it's probably going to be the case that like you can either choose to use the same pseudonym for all of your writings if you want to build an identity, or like you could with a pseudonym status quo, you can choose to recreate yourself every time you write a new book. Fourthly, I think it's still eminently feasible while preserving perfect anonymity to get people be paid for their writings and to get paid taxes without revealing their name. Like Banksy has managed this. We could probably set up some Ethereum smart contracts such as this would be feasible. I don't think that like implementation ought to be a part of this debate. Fifthly, I'm going to presume that like I think a good chunk of history would also be relatively anonymous. Like maybe we don't know who Kant is. Maybe they have some other like swear word adjacent name. For all those reasons, like I think this debate is literally, we just don't know who is writing. First argument, we get way more free speech and we think free speech is a phenomenally good thing. Under our side, I think what governments do is they have the ability to scan some writing, but given they don't know like who has published it, basically what they do is once something is uploaded, they have the ability to go through the pre-existing processes to decide whether or not this contravenes their hate speech law or whatever other legislation they have. Under their side, this thing presumably exists, but one, the vast majority of writers will choose to be public because once you have a public persona, your ability to have like interviews, etc., and build this means you make a ton more money, which means the abilities of governments to shut them down before they have actually written something is substantially larger. But two, there's a ton of cancel culture because if someone doesn't like who you are, they can send the paparazzi around to their house, they can send you death threats, they can respond to your Twitter threads and make the vast majority of your life really, really unpleasant. Why is it that we have a substantial increase, therefore, in free speech under our side of the house? Firstly, I think governments, to the extent that they are able to act, are now exclusively forced to do so retroactively, which means that given the internet like reshares things all the time, and I keep seeing Reddit posts that were removed because the person didn't like them, that have then been saved on this like the Wayback Machine, whatever, means that the vast majority of the stuff is likely to be accessible all around the world, given there are huge incentives not to shut down the internet. I think this means the capacity of governments to shut down things like free speech is substantially constrained versus a world where people having identities that they have an incentive to report in order to get any credence because that's their competition means that they're likely to be shut down. Secondly, I think governments are actually extraordinarily unlikely versus like cancel culture and similar things to actually shut down on free speech. Firstly, there are reasonably way more concerns about the potential for government overreach that means that they are substantially constrained in what they do. Things like the Constitution exist. Things like being worried that you look like you're cracking down on the opposition means that often parties don't want to do this sort of thing, which is not a constraint that exists for the average person. They're substantially more accountable. But secondly, when it comes to voting, there is a massive cognitive dissonance because the average person likes the idea of free speech until they have an instance of free speech that opposes their views. This means when it comes to voting, by and large, people tend to vote for free speech policies because they acknowledge they don't want a government, because they believe that they like it when they're confronted with things that oppose them. But when it comes to actually someone saying something like, I am a TERF or TERF adjacent views, they're perfectly happy to say this person should be cancelled, they should never be able to speak again, there should be no platforms, and in some instances turn to large amounts of violence under their side of the house. So for those reasons, I think it's substantially more likely that cancel culture and similar things are likely to happen. What do I think this does? Firstly, I think it means that a bunch of people just get shut down. That is, it becomes politically unpopular to have them in a public limelight because they are publicly decried as being a bad person. The long run means they can then be outcompeted by people who are able to have public personas and then able to speak out against them, which I think is bad. Secondly, I think people just censor themselves, right? To the extent that they are trying to build an online identity, they have a strong incentive not to express political opinions, to withdraw from these sorts of things. I think for those reasons, you're much less likely to get free expression under their side of the house. I'll take closing.
people want to talk about really politically sensitive things and not get cracked down on, why can't they just make the choice of using a pseudonym rather than having a world where everyone does it?
So I think the problem is, in a world where everyone does this, having a pseudonym makes you relatively dehumanizes you and means that everyone else who has a platform is able to say, why didn't they come forward and debate me? It is in a world where that is not the obligation. These people actually have credence, where people can't just say, look at me, I have a background, I matter. That is a thing I think I addressed in this argument. Why is it that this freedom of expression is a relatively good thing? One, I think we should have epistemic modesty to the extent that the views that exist now are vastly different from what people believed at every period in the history. Presumably, there are some things that we could be substantially misinformed about right now. Secondly, I think in many cases, the people have relatively regressive views and are likely to suppress large-scale movements for change, which means that what ends up happening is that when people express relatively radical views, they face a ton of backlash, and it's this rather than governments that prevents them from actually getting their voices out, from people engaging this, and then subsequently to have the capacity to change people's views. But thirdly, it is preferable to actually engage with this stuff rather than have cancel culture shut it down. What do we think happens is that when people are explicitly shamed, presumably under both sides, you can say this person is a bad person. Only under one side you actually know their identity. But that's when people are far more likely to believe this is a very aggressive attack, to attach it to a person who looks like them, who they identify with, and then to subsequently be substantially more aggrieved about the toxic culture and the extent to which this is happening. Secondly, I think if this is lack of expression, a bunch of people still hold this view, but then are more likely to turn to more extreme forms. The fact that relatively moderate people who do care about maintaining a moderate audience are unable to express these views in the long run means that you force them towards more and more worse political extremes. So to the extent these views are bad, they are likely to be worse under their side of the house. Second thing, on the extent, I guess this is just a broad bucket of social justice claims, right? I think people lend a ton of credence to names and personalities. Firstly, I think it's just very hard to divorce writings from the person that made them, right? It seems like you're making an implicit statement about J.K. Rowling every time you say, I like Harry Potter, even though, both of them are bad and no one should approve of either of them. But secondly, because I think authority is generically extraordinarily hard to establish, because it's not clear when I read a book, if it's good or bad, right? I could just be bad at appreciating what fine art is. So when someone tells me these are great books, I will read Conrad and be like, oh yeah, it could be great, even though it's really, really boring. So I think people to a large extent resort to questions about whether or not this person is authoritative, whether or not they matter. And in many cases, this relies largely on the basis of race. What does this look, or other protected groups? I think this means, for instance, that women and minorities are substantially more likely to be discredited simply for publishing works, because we have the preconception that they might be less entitled to opinions in a certain sphere because they didn't go to the right universities. I don't think this means that you still can't have scientists who are able to claim backgrounds, because presumably they could just have all of their papers on Elsevier or Archive under the same pseudonym. But it does mean that you can't say, I went to Harvard, therefore I have this pre-claim to greatness and I know what is happening. The reason I think this is good is that, firstly, I think we substantially disempower the extent to which people associate identities with qualities, because the concept of identity that you get from all of your writing, from all of your education, is substantially disattached from who the person is, right? Like if someone claims to be a white person that wrote a philosophical text, I have no idea. So the basis of believing that the canon is majority white and therefore this reflects well on white people just goes away entirely, because we have no idea what these identities are. But secondly, I think we're much more likely to get women and minorities actually able to express themselves, to have their views represented. Proud to propose.
I think that's speaker for those remarks. Council Leader of Opposition, turn the case to the backbench. Whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. I am just making sure that I am heard. Cool. Beginning in, sorry, phone almost turned off. Beginning in 3, 2, 1. A few notes on the burdens in this debate. It is perfectly possible, if Gov is going to invent Ethereum-based technology, was it, that would ensure protection for the rest of eternity, that we on OpBench simply say, weirdly based, but not everyone has to use it, right? That we could keep the same level of protection for marginalized people who are afraid of being murdered in an authoritarian state if they so wish. But if there are people for whom they absolutely want to be able to use their name, they can. And I understand OG is celebrating this response, but here's the thing, right? It doesn't dehumanize you if in some instances people choose to use a pseudonym and in some instances they don't. For example, J.K. Rowling is a pseudonym. She wanted to be seen as a white man, so that way her books could be published, right? It did not dehumanize her. The dehumanizing part was her speeches about trans people, right? So it's not really clear why it is that this is a unique benefit for their side of the house if we're able to fiat this type of technology symmetrically. So I want to talk about something that I think is incredibly important for this debate. Your name, I think, is incredibly unique. Historically, in many indigenous cultures all across the world, names are very unique in the sense that they carry specific powers and meaning. The fact that they are based in specific cultures and things that people want out of their own children, meant to represent symbols and ideas going on into the future. The problem that exists, thank you, when it comes to using pseudonyms is multiple fold. The first is the ability for political art to be easily co-opted under their side of the house. First of all, this is just historically true, right? There have been plenty of instances of very prominent indigenous authors who are just white guys who have no indigenous ancestry, but because they were able to use indigenous pseudonyms to make themselves seem like they were an part of this culture, they got to form their own culture through a colonizing lens, which they then used to be able to continue the dehumanization of indigenous people in the country in which they lived. But the problem with this becomes greater than this, right? It is that a lot of this type of artwork is very specifically questioning colonizing aspects of status quo, whether it be questioning specific political institutions or ways in which people currently think under status quo about how it is that they want society to be able to function and how people think. But the problem that exists is that currently, even when people use their names, it is very easy for those in a settler white majority to superimpose their own ideas onto text. What do I mean by this? Very easily, when an artist writes about how they are depressed in the society in which they live, it is very easy for I, as a white guy, to just go, yeah, I know what they're talking about. This is about depression. My mom died. I'm very sad about this. But I missed the nuance there about the fact that it is a specific type of sadness to a culture that was stolen from you through a process of colonization, that it is a specific sadness to the fact that you will never get to speak your language ever again through these processes of colonization. This gets lost under their side of the house because when you are forced to use pseudonyms, I understand OG's responses, but you can use the same pseudonym over and over, but you don't necessarily get the ability to tell much more about yourself than this. If their example is Banksy, no one knows who the fuck he is or anything about him, because the more you try to cultivate an online presence, the more you try to talk about which nation you come from, where specifically you currently live, it is easier and easier to have identifiable characteristics about who you are, which means that the art fundamentally becomes significantly less personal and understandable to the public then, which means they superimpose a lot of their own aspects onto the work. Why is this a bad thing? Well, it's because it means this work is less able to challenge that very idea that the art is trying to do. To not just use indigenous examples, right? Already under status quo, we see things like the letter from the burning of jail by Martin Luther King regularly be co-opted by literally Nazis in the Republican Party about how it is that cancel culture or whatever is necessarily a bad thing and that that's what the letter already means. But when it's easier to see this pseudonym as just being some other person devoid of any context and history, because as 60 years go on, it is harder to remember exactly what that person said about themselves when it came to their own pseudonym. There's no material thing that you're able to connect them to, no movement associated with that type of letter. This type of co-option becomes easier and easier, and the messages that existed in these works over time are something that become more and more vague. It means that we're constantly starting from zero over and over again as these types of contexts get lost to power structures who don't necessarily want to accept these criticisms. Further than this, it means that individual bookshelves don't get decolonized, right? It's very difficult to make claims about the importance of indigenous art, Black art, Latin American art, etc., when it comes to colonizing institutions, when it is incredibly difficult to know the difference between the types of artists that exist within these spaces, right? So that in turn means that these systems propagate themselves as well. It's harder to see the development of growth of individual artists. There's two different stems to this type of argument, right? The first is that if OG wants to use Kant as their example, right, it's probably really important to know that Kant was a colonizer. He openly supported colonization and race-based science to be able to do things like measure people's skulls as a part of, literal like colonization within the rest of the world, right? So to use that and cross-apply that to his own academic work in the categorical imperative allows us to have a much greater understanding of why it is that this work doesn't necessarily fully apply to indigenous advocacy and why it is that there's specific unique vectors through which to analyze this work. Under their side of the house, it's completely devoid of context. It maybe is under the same pseudonym, but it's difficult to understand what the correlations are because you can't analyze the guy that existed politically and the social actions that they took, but you also don't necessarily have to have it under the same pseudonym, which in turn means that these criticisms become significantly more devoid of context. Closing.
So I think everyone agrees that getting more ideas out there is good. Your entire case presumes that given information about people's identity, the broad swath of society will use that information in a progressive rather than regressive way. You have not proven that argument.
So First of all, it doesn't really matter if we prove one is more likely than the other. The fact that the progressive lens now becomes way more difficult and almost impossible to do, in turn means that there's less analyses of art and culture, and in turn means that marginalized people are significantly more likely to not write because they don't necessarily see that their art is going to have much value, both to communities that they're from and to being able to challenge mainstream society. But two, even if people react regressively to this, right, it's not necessarily clear how regressive people are going to act when under your side of the house, right? Things that OG's complaining about, like more cancel culture, like, yeah, death threats are bad. That's symmetric. Nobody is supporting death threats under our side of the house. But things like criticizing an artist for being a piece of shit, based, good. We think there should be more of that. If the principle of opening government is free speech, calling someone a cunt is an act of free speech, right? And it's not clear why it is that that's an inherent bad thing for their side of the house. If the response is going to be that authoritarian governments or other bad actors are going to use this to try to remove dissenting opinions, right? It's still not necessarily clear why it is that this is a comparative win if we can leverage their mechanism, nor is it necessarily clear why it is that this is a comparative win if those institutions still have power over every single vessel in society, and the literature that is used to galvanize political movements to try to push for change now are significantly depowered under their side of the house. Those institutions remain unchanging and the power dynamics remain exactly the same. So it's not necessarily clear how it is that there's suddenly a new wave if these types of voices are depowered. We're proud to stand in opposition.
Great. Let's speak for those marks. DPM, whenever you're ready.
Hello. I'd like for people to turn their cameras on in general because I like seeing faces on a debate. And I'd also appreciate it if people could exclusively POI by waving as opposed to typing anything in the chat. First, on free speech, political expression is the most important impact in the debate. The reason for this is because your need to know the artist's identity is most relevant when you're trying to arrest them or put them behind bars. In that kind of fashion, when it comes purely to discourse and conversation, note that the symmetric incentive exists to comment on the work and to get your ideas out there, even if you have to write, "I'm a Black person" in the first chapter, as opposed to having your name on the front page. Why is this important? Because in the status quo, it is impossible for them to limit this oppression on freedom of speech for two reasons. The first is political repression is inevitable. The cowardly stance that O takes is that, well, we can just have everyone choose to protect pseudonyms. To be very clear, this House prefers debate. On a very fundamental level, it is a comparison between a hypothetical world versus the status quo. I think in the status quo, it's very, very clear that autocratic governments have a very powerful ability to break through pseudonyms. This isn't true on our side because world which happens everywhere, even in authoritarian countries, because their writing is still writing, you're able to have infrastructure that gets around these things. So on our side, writing is completely safe from autocrats. But two, because on their side, at best, they're able to limit the word, they're able to limit this to some extent, but people end up facing the consequences for their actions anyways, whenever they show their faces, and that's really, really bad because free speech isn't free if you know that you're under threat because of it. So Greg's given you a whole bunch of reasons why we access this. We get no response other than the attempt to co-opt from OO. Why is it that this is really, really important? The first reason for this is because just very, very simply, because on our side, it then becomes impossible to silence progressive and protest work. The reason for this is because at best, governments can retroactively try to remove writing, but things such as paper copies, things such as writing that is published and seen and screenshotted by hundreds of thousands of web citizens is still remaining. That means that they can't use fear as a deterrent, which means that the dissemination of ideas throughout society and the beginnings of regime change are there. Why is it that the information is key to regime change and increased accessibility and well-being for human beings? The reason for this is because governments almost always retain power by having a selectorate, i.e. a small group of privileged people, in order to ignore the number of the rest of the population. The problem is, the larger the number of people who actively oppose them is, the more expensive and costly this becomes. Because, for example, the army has to go out and put down more protests, because plutocrats have to spend much more time trying to retract the surplus labor of the people. And I think that for those reasons, the turning point on our side is that autocratic governments don't exist, people don't get thrown into jails, women don't get forced into hiding because they're afraid to go to school. I think this is by far the most important impact of the debate. Why then does it still achieve enough to win the debate in the most Western and liberal democracies possibly? The reason for this is because the benefits of freedom of speech apply far more to progressive thinkers than regressive bigotry. The reason for this is twofold. The first is regressive bigotry is almost always people like white supremacists, like homophobes, like sexists, i.e. those who have been deposed from the main center of thought. That means the flow of society is moving away from them, which means that even if they're able to speak more on upside, which to be reasonable, they definitely do, they don't convince people in the same way that heartfelt piece on critical race theory can on ours. But the second main thing is because the harms of silencing people and forcing them underground are also much worse and extreme on their side. The reason is, again, because these are people who are deposed and who are forming the establishment. They've accumulated a lot of power over the years. Oftentimes they're aligned with NRA, for example, or things such as wealthy families who have the money to make sure that they can do whatever the fuck they want and enact hate crime. And I think that means that the silencing means that they are driven to action. The final thing is just, in the worst case scenario, that we do have to face the harms of incels. Why is this still enough to win? The first reason for this is because freedom of speech is an inherent right that can never be taken away. The reason for this is because even though, I think everyone agrees here that thought crime is the worst violation of all, because it takes away any agency and privacy as a human being you have inside your own head. I would posit that insofar as you have these thoughts, but can never communicate them to anyone else, especially when they're the ones that are most near and dear to you, that too is a violation that we can never accept. That's the second thing I want to say, is because disproportionately speaking, the harm is just much more important than things such as where they can appreciate art, because the uniqueness is much less. The second thing I want to talk about then is social justice, because that's the majority of the OO case. The key clash is, does anonymity allow people to overcome the barriers posed to them by establishments, or does it allow us to do things such as increase the degree to which, or does it mean that their cultural appropriation happens, they're misconstrued, they can't speak out? The first thing I want to say is just very simply, in the same way that Banksy explains the meaning of his art anonymously through Twitter, for example, I think landmark artists who talk about their work probably can also have this platform. But the second main thing is just the essence of this question is that of this clash is whether it's good for us to enhance the information that we get from racial minority authors, or whether it's bad to subject them to disadvantages. Before I go any further, I'll take CO. CO? Okay, nothing from CO.
Wait. So when it comes to your claim about free speech, firstly, there's still the risk that authoritarian states could uncover what your pseudonym is. That would probably be symmetric, meaning that the chilling effect wouldn't really.
That's on POI. My response to this would be the fact that this motion says all writing is pseudonymous really suggests that you can't just scope out half the world. Okay, so why does it that the importance, the ability to overcome disadvantages and overcome barriers and do things like enter a school curricula is much more important than the ability to enhance information? The first reason is because our difference is categorical rather than quantitative, i.e. it's not a marginal increase in information, it's access to these ideas in the first place. The second main reason is because the benefits that they enjoy apply only to relatively liberal state places already. Because yes, Black authors do get platform in some really privileged international schools, but these people already access these liberal ideas. And the third reason is because, to be honest, it's just a basic right that these people have to be able to take their work and make sure it's in the hallowed halls of that everything else does. Why is it that we're able to achieve this? Because pseudonymity means that they're able to disguise their identities, and that is the norm, and they're able to write incredibly powerful, beautiful, moving writing that has a huge cultural impact on the world. And then it is possible for them to reveal who they are, and in doing so, have a further massive impact. And I think because of all of this, because it's impossible to look at a book and say, this person is clearly a woman, I'm not reading it, and that being way more of a barrier than the nuances of reading a book cover to cover, which people rarely do, I'm very happy to pose.
That's it for the remarks. I'll call upon the PLO to close out the top half of this debate whenever you're ready.
Hi there, can you hear me? Okay, sounds good. 1 second. All right, 1 second. Let me just tell my roommates to be quiet. All right, guys, can you just be quiet for a bit? I'm gonna do my speech now. Sorry, I'm back. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 礼基时，李泰勒, Keystone, happiness, laughter, and opportunity. My parents were telling me the other day how they had been thinking of a way to embody values and meaning into my name even before I was born. They named me Li Jishi and Li Taile because they want me to live a life of happiness, of laughter, and one with opportunity. Growing up in the West, not only were my parents forced to give me an English name so that I wouldn't be bullied, so that people would be able to pronounce it, so that I would have an identity congruent with the dominant culture, I was stripped of the most core aspect of the ways in which I can understand myself, my culture, my family, and the people that I love. I was stripped of the most critical point of my identity, which is my name. And it's only when I went back to China to go to school, being called that name by people who spoke my language, by people with similar names to me, that we would connect to each other on that basis, that I understand the significance of my name of Li Jishi. I want to be very, very clear with the framing of this debate panel, and you cannot let the government side scroll their way out of this. This debate is not a dichotomy between using pseudonyms on their side versus just not using them on our side. The motion's wording is very clear. This House prefers a world where all writing is pseudonyms. Therefore, the burden is also very clear. 1, government has to explain why in all instances, the use of pseudonyms would be more beneficial than if the author were to choose to use their own name. Second, on opposition, all we have to do is to win this debate is prove why there are a variety of instances in which the use of your real name is preferable than that of pseudonyms, and the use of such mechanisms actually makes that writing or the ability for people to connect to that meaningfully worse. First, I want to talk about a couple of things. The breakthrough pseudonyms. It sounds rhetorically effective, but note the extremely shaky mechanisms that OG gives you about like the whole free speech thing, because all they say is, well, now that everyone does it in authoritarian regimes, will no longer be able to find you like who you are. First of all, lots of artists are using pseudonyms historically, weren't killed by the state. But like the real analysis though, is that 1, they never at any point in their speech explain to you why pseudonyms are the primary mechanism by which this has happened in the past. The use of anonymous social media burner accounts, untraceable pay-as-you-go phones. This is refutation that Shang Wu given his Wudig speech. So like obviously it's correct. But second of all, it's just unclear why if they can find people who are using pseudonyms on our side. Why can't they just do this on their side of the house? Presumably, if you're publishing online to disseminate your information, since physical writing is easy to trace within these authoritarian regimes, if they're found out on our side under a pseudonym, because I don't know, they track their IP address or something, literally, I do not know where the link is in the gov case at all to explain why this meaningfully is different on their side of the house. So don't let government get away with this specific burden. They also just aren't meeting their burden. Like this free speech stuff has been like the status quo, and it's unclear how much more free speech their side gets as a result. Like, yeah, it's bad when artists get fucked over, but like, I just like don't know how bad it is when weighed against all the various harms that Ethan already gave to you. And okay, the problem also with this is that there's no way to know who the artists are. Government says, oh, well, now your name is also incredibly important on our side in dispute, to dispute our framing. I really don't think this is how it works, because there's other like types of ways in which people find value in other people's like writing and work. But even if this is the case on our side, we'll still take this burden, because we argue that Ethan already gives you analysis for that where it goes utterly uncontested in the DPM, which is that your name is incredibly important in the process of understanding art in the first place, especially in the context of things like diasporic text. For example, NC is a trans mixed race, mixed race Asian poet who publishes directly under her name directly, writing about the experiences of the Asian diaspora in the West. You guys should actually follow her. She's pretty sick. But despite growing up in the West with a white name, she chooses to use her Chinese name Enxi because of the power that her name has in the ways that she can contextualize her work in that regard. You wrote something in not a homogenous language or identity. In those regards, your name and its attachment to this kind of art represents the context and culture perspective that must be taken into account when evaluating this kind of thing in the first place. Unless there's a really good archiving job, you have like names under the same pseudonym, it becomes very difficult to create those connections if you choose to like use like an ethnic name. Especially one, considering on their side, even in their best case, they live in a society where everyone knows that the work they're reading is done under a pseudonym. So the benefit of pseudonyms is actually lost on the government side, right? Because the point is that the point of a pseudonym panel is that you're oblivious to the fact that the person you're reading the work, you're reading for the work is using a pseudonym to protect themselves in the first place. They lose their value on government side. So even if you accept OG's benefits, you get those better on our side of the house when you have people publishing under real names and some people choosing to publish under pseudonyms if they so wish to do so in the first place as well. It's unclear how this is a benefit that's mutually exclusive. But second of all, it's not just about the use of the ethnic name itself. It's that it is your name that you were disempowered from using, and that your work that you choose to publish is distinctly the experiences and work of someone like Enxi, someone like Li Jixi. But also you have been systematically alienated from the use of your name. And this is incredibly important, right? Because these voices are necessary in the context of decolonial or anti-racist framework of understanding contextually the experience of these people within the West. And it's an extremely important part of like political writing. The ability to gloss over it, you take it like on their side of the house, means you take the weight of the work being produced. Sure, you can maybe open up like your book by saying, this is the lived experience of, for example, an Asian woman or like an Asian person within the Western context. But that still is different than reading, this is the work of this specific Asian person, Li Jixi, and this is their experience, and this is how you should understand their life story, and this is how you can understand the body of work that they've been writing and been creating up until this point in the first place as well. You lose all of that context at the point at which you publish under a pseudonym, because you lose like the intimacy that you have with that writing in the first place as well. But also just want to talk about how the access to institutional power is lower too. Because if you don't know the difference between various authors, under the pseudonym, you have to be very private. It's like, sure, you can post about your life or something like that, like under your pseudonym, but the remainder of it has to be incredibly private, or else you risk compromising your identity, which defeats the purpose of the pseudonym in the first place. So your criticism of the status quo, it has to be the most blunt form of text as well. In those cases, you get significantly worse outcomes in those regards. This also ties into the fact that Ethan already talks about how it's hard to engage as an artist in the discussion of the art. But before I go on this, I'll take a POI from closing. 3, 2, 1, opening.
So you think that this debate is about pseudonyms, but only when nobody cares enough who they are, whereas in the status quo, apparently people who really, really need it can use pseudonyms and be anonymous.
Look, maybe in some fantasy world where people really don't care too much about like their identities as tied to their name in the first place, then maybe in that world, people won't really value like the inability to connect with the author on the basis of their name in the first place. But the reality is that the lived experiences and material conditions of people in the status quo requires a degree of connection and intimacy with the artist that you so choose to connect with in the first place as well. The letter from Birmingham jail, for example, is powerful because we know it is written like by Martin Luther King, not because it's written under some other type of pseudonym, and we understand his whole body of work leading up to the his conglomeration and like entire body of work leading up to that point as well. And the reason why this is harmful is because it's easy for you as a reader to also superimpose like your ability to like your own experiences onto that author as well. And given our previous analysis about how it's harder to engage as an artist in the discussion of art, to weigh in on the ongoing discussion surrounding your art and your writing in the first place as well, the inability for you to weigh in on the ongoing interpretation of work is something you no longer get on their side as well. So the active reinterpretation and the understanding of constant engagement within discourse surrounding your writing in the first place as well also gets significantly worse on their side, and you get significantly less benefits for your ability to connect to those experiences on their side as well. And notably as well, in those aspects, you lose entirely like on that comparative. I want to know very quickly that I tried to engage with like back half, so take that into account. Pro to stand in opposition.
Great. I think that's been for those remarks. I'll call upon a member of government at the back half of this debate whenever you're ready.
Okay. Give me a moment. All right. Let's start time now. I think the failure of the opening half in this debate is that their ability to imagine a world that is different from our own is severely constrained. The assumptions that undergird the entirety of the government and the opposition case relies on a world in which much of the credibility that goes to writing still comes from their name and still comes from their identity. And if we snap our fingers, take the current world and make all writing anonymous, what happens then? The problem is that in a world in which most writing emerged organically in a pseudonymous way, people still prize credibility. People still prize having writing that is authentic to meaningful experiences and conveys useful ideas. And the norms that we had surrounding writing would be different in that world. And so what we're going to do in closing government is pretty simple. I'll explain quite explicitly how we'll differentiate ourselves from our opening. So they've helpfully given analysis for why free speech is good and why protecting certain ideas can be valuable. There's 3 additional things we're going to offer. Number 1, I think that they haven't done enough to give a justification for why this is something that is always preferable. So we will explain why, even on top of the works that they protect that we agree are valuable, why the culture of creation itself changes, and therefore while the types of work that exist in both cases are likely to be better on our side. Secondly, then we'll show you how we meet the bar for how we can still demonstrate credibility of meaningful experiences beyond smart contracts and beyond saying you are Black in the first sentence, and how societal norms would have evolved to prize experiences more than identity. Finally, then we'll prove why all of these cultural changes matter, even if you're not in an authoritarian regime that is simply modeled to not know who the writer is. So firstly, why are cults of personality uniquely bad, and how does current writing play into aggressive cults of personality? What we say is that in the status quo, people develop their credibility in writers as lots of different ways. They develop that credibility both from the quality of their work and the reliability of what they're saying. For example, if I publish a paper that is utterly bullshit, I will lose credibility, even if I myself speak very prettily. But also people develop credibility from the actual individual, from their name and people being able to link that work to the writer. That is the norm that exists in the status quo. When people produce popular writings, we say they often generate substantial attention in the initial phase, and that causes them to generate large followings. That is, people like people who put out things that they agree with. And so it's very easy for people to coalesce around those particular people. We say that this often leads to cults of personality. That is, writers who typically have desirable characteristics by our society, people who are viewed generally to have lived experiences that are similar to the vast majority of people who consume writing. For example, in the US, it tends to be white people. In India, it tends to be Hindu people. In Singapore, it tends to be wealthier Chinese people who live in the cities. These are typically the people who we tend to create these cults of personality around, not only because their work is valuable, but because when we can match it to a specific individual, that individual is an archetype of the kind of person we like in society. They meet other desirable social characteristics, not just in their ideas, but in the kind of way that they perform their life day to day. And that becomes a meaningful factor in how we judge these people as writers. This then results in a situation in which many writers develop a huge cult of personality and develop fame, particularly those that have these desirable social characteristics. We want to be clear here. Fame is an extremely powerful force. When people generate fame, they become addicted to it. Not only are they less likely to do anything that will harm the underlying base of support that they have generated, because people are now dependent on a huge amount of attention every single day. They're dependent on a large group of people that could quickly turn against them if they say something they disagree with. But also, fame has effects on people who don't get fame, right? When other writers see that there is a certain group of writers who has a huge culture of personality, that has fame, that has desirable social characteristics, they are much less likely to come forward knowing that they don't have those desirable social characteristics, and that it's unlikely that they would ever be able to attain that kind of cult of personality, given that their ideas might be more controversial or more outside of the mainstream. So what are the results of this? We think the first thing that happens is that even these writers who are in these majoritarian groups may have contrarian ideas, they may have meaningful and nuanced perspectives, but they're very, very likely on their side to only produce one type of viewpoint insofar as it reaffirms the existing base of support that they have, and insofar as it is the only thing that ensures that addicting drug continues to flow their way. But secondly, it means that other writers who have different viewpoints that are contradictory, diverse, or unique are much less likely to attain fulfillment from writing, to receive resources for their writing, etc., in a world in which they cannot attain these cults of personality. The way that we change this is by changing the norms surrounding writing as a whole. On our side, the person does not matter. It is their ideas that matter. Ideas are far harder for people to be biased against in the same way, or even for states to oppress, if that is what you care about on opening government, because it is much harder when people first hear the idea and then later at some point might become aware of an individual. That is, if somebody knows, for example, that you're a Black writer who has an experience that's kind of dissimilar to them from the cover of the book, they probably don't pick up the book, and so they don't read what you have to say. But when your writing is published under a pseudonym and they read your ideas and you have persuasive weight, then even if the state, per the POI from Closing Opposition, finds out who that person is later on, if more people have been persuaded by that idea because they didn't prejudge the person initially, they quite literally did not judge the book by the cover, it is just much less likely then that those people can be ostracized from society or that their ideas can be easily dismissed. This is the way that we increase the diversity of thought on our side. I'll take CO in about a minute. Second point on our side, though, we get more accountability and credibility, and we demonstrate it in a better way. So the thing I want to make clear here is that writing needs credibility on either side of this debate, right? All of the powerful analysis we got from Opening Opposition about why you can't just say something, you needed to have a lived experience for that thing to matter, are things that will probably still matter insofar as people want to hear from individuals that have credibility on given subjects. They want to consume information that is relatively reliable and has some kind of weight. We say that people can still demonstrate this on our side, right? They will add vivid descriptions to their writing of lived experiences that suggest that they have credibility. In academic context, they may use things like disclosures or peer review to show that they nonetheless are people who have credibility to talk about something, even if they can't prove that they went to Harvard University. Specifically, we think publishers may establish a norm where anonymity can happen, but people can nonetheless verify crucial aspects such that they are allowed to publish these works. Quickly, CO.
Why can a fan base centered on a specific type of readership not develop around a pseudonym, which still encourages the pseudonym author to keep writing the same kind of ideas and entrenched majoritarianism?
So a couple of things, right? The first thing is that there will always be some aspect of this fame that is tied to the content you produce. We say that will always exist, but there is a separate portion that is tied to your identity, that is tied to having characteristics that are majoritarian, and we get rid of that aspect. Secondly, you can't generate a consistent fan base when anyone else could also publish under the same pseudonym and arguably steal your fire. And thirdly, even if you did want to keep your fan base, you could also publish other things under other pseudonyms and still have some kind of meaningful following. The key I want to make under the second point, though, is that right now credibility comes from identity. When you don't have your identity, people believe there is something wrong, something that is lacking. And so people write off these works and don't engage with them. And even when you do have identity, even when you do provide an identity, if that is where your credibility comes from, it is much easier for all of the regressive forces in our society to be used against you. I.e., if I know who you are and I want to discredit your ideas, it's easier for me to find out about bad things you do and leak them to the press, or to target you for other things that you've said, et cetera, et cetera. On our side, credibility comes from lived experiences and comes from your ideas. And that is a world in which the norms surrounding credibility are far more inclusive. The culture of writing changes, the ideas that we get on our side change. We're very proud to propose.
Great, let's get those remarks. Emma, whenever you're ready.
All right. Please offer POIs exclusively in the chat. Three extensions from closing opposition. Firstly, why more writing is created, and that is the most important thing. Secondly, why we're better for equality in writing. And finally, a principle about self-expression. Before that, I have two responses to closing government. Firstly, as Max observes in a POI, cults of personality will still be generated under either side of the house based on famous pseudonyms that exist, which is why we know about things like famous pseudonyms that exist historically. Authors will have an incentive to use one pseudonym rather than juggle between multiple, because this is still a way in which you're able to build up credibility. What this then means is that if someone has like a really famous pseudonym, you're likely to give their work default credibility as opposed to new individuals who are trying to break into the market. Secondly, it is a lie that people cannot be biased against ideas. If you're reading a feminist text, you're probably going to assume that that text was created by women under either side of the house, so the underlying idea is still a metric by which we judge the validity of text. Our first extension is how more writing is created. I have three mechanisms for this. Firstly, when you're operating under a pseudonym, it is harder to make money from art. Firstly, the kind of platforms in which you can market things is substantially limited when you have to remain anonymous. So there would probably still be things like online selling platforms, but you can't do things like have in-person book fairs or scientific networking events when it comes to things like academic research, where other people are going to know what your identity ultimately is. Secondly, it's harder to profit from your writing by building up a brand, as CG kind of conceived. There's not a brand in terms of fame, but it's about an ancillary brand where you often go to events that are like related to your text. So if you write a book, you often give talks about your book after the fact. If you develop research, you often go on to speak about these things, and it's often these other events where you're able to profit from, where you're able to charge things like ticket fees, and you're able to get sponsorships from those kind of events. So for people who create writing because they are profit motivated, which I've posited in a very capitalistic society is like a lot of people, they're less inclined to do this. The second thing to say here is that for certain writing, it is very, very difficult to profit, and therefore most of the benefits come from public kind of reputation, and you substantially limit that under their side of the house. This is particularly true for certain kinds of academic research that is not for profit, but people often do this to like get good reputation, build up their CV to help jumpstart their career at a later date. Obviously, in a job interview, you can't say, well, like I wrote this under this pseudonym, because that clearly gives away your identity, which would then be outframed by the opening government model. It's not just about helping your career, but it's also just about things like building a brand, about being a moral person. If you can point to the fact that you've done things like philanthropic research and stuff like that. The final mechanism to say here is that you lose the ability to defend yourself when your writing is being publicly bastardized, which specifically disincentivizes writings about deeply sensitive things. So if you're writing about things like an experience in a genocide, like when writing First They Killed My Father about the Cambodia genocide, or just deeply triggering personal experiences, when other people have this writing and they interpret it how they want, you never have the ability to publicly say, this is actually my identity, this is what I personally meant. So specifically to writing about deeply personal and sensitive things, we will always lose the ability to re-clarify and to advocate for what your work actually is. Impacting what was is the most important argument. Firstly, this is really, really important for advancing the academic canon. Writing is also research-based, and scientific studies are really, really important, which is often the kind of work that is not for profit, meaning that people often do this to jumpstart their career and stuff like that. Scientific studies like cancer research often build up on previous studies that were made in order to avoid individuals having to do things like duplicative research. Therefore, I think that for advancing the societal canon of knowledge, when it comes to things like targeting healthcare and climate change research, where even one scientific advancement being made under our side of the house can trigger a massive social benefit when it comes to one new kind of treatment being made that has a guaranteed impact for helping millions of people, is a reason enough to vote for CO on this motion. Secondly, this is really important when it comes to personal enjoyment. Reading things is often really escapist. It's about reading someone who had an experience like your own about grief or about heartbreak and feeling less like you were a lonely pawn in the universe and like other people have actually had the same experience of you. The reason why we crucially need a lot of art is that different people have different life experiences, relate to different things, and therefore we want to maximize the kind of art that is available to people. Finally, art is really valuable when it comes to social change. Firstly, it is less politicized than like other social movements advocating for things, but secondly, it's often the most illustrative, so it has the unique ability to tap into things like your empathetic heartstrings. What this then means that when you read about other people's lived experiences, it better helps you break out of your own epistemic paradigm and actually relate to what other people on the ground are experiencing. Way against free speech, it's just so marginal, but you can already use a pseudonym when the state can crack down on you anyways. For cancel culture, they can kick you out, even if you're using a pseudonym from like a website. And sometimes cancel culture is good. I reckon if you were being a TERF, you probably should be yeeted from things like an online platform. Second extension, why we are better for promoting equality in writing. OG says, and CG repeats, if it is being written by a woman, then people aren't going to read it because it will be seen as being less credible. Firstly, intuition pump, massive overstatement, right? A lot of the most famous authors in the current day and age are people like Suzanne Collins, who are super prominent. In highly sexist contexts, women could do things like use a pseudonym of a man anyways. Secondly, and this is crucial, these same privileged structures exist under their side of the house where it creates a networking effect. So if you're submitting an application to join something like a news company, you might not give your name, but if you still say, haha, I went to Harvard, you're going to be seen as being more credible. It's often about using things like more money on websites where you have to pay to have your own books and your own research elevated. You can often pay to kind of get your work front loaded. So even though this is anonymous, there's still privileged networking effects. How do we flip their argument? Firstly, it's harder to call out a lack of diversity. Major news companies can be criticized under our side of the house for having too many white writers and they lose at checks and balance. Secondly, they get fewer minority artists clarifying text. OO says it's important to like look to someone's history. This relies on people researching people who wrote the things. No, it is about people being an advocate after the fact. It's about Kimberly Crenshaw being able to clarify what she meant by intersectionality. It's not just oppression being additive, it's about oppression being multiplying in effect. It's also about things like being an advocate about your text. So Lung Un talking about the Cambodian genocide and Betty Friedan talking about the feminine mystique. The reason why we need text is because often a credibility gap when it comes to activism. So we need people being tied to their text in order to be taken seriously. Opening government.
The average writer, academic or otherwise, has a tiny audience and therefore is paid very little for talks on top of book sales. This suggests your impacts on the incentive to write only apply to already established writers.
3 mechanisms, and that is just also not true. Even for some people, if you can make like 10,000 grand, that's also a valuable side job that can help support you financially. So we get more advocacy under our side of the house about things that are linked to your text that make you credible, but it's really important advocating for rights and basic moral minimums for groups of people. Finally, on self-expression. People have a right to take ownership for what they are doing. Writing is a form of intellectual property where you often are putting emotional labor into your text, physical time, and often time when it comes to things like academic research. The crucial nuance here is that art is often undercompensated under the status quo, especially for marginalized groups of people, which means that the key benefit that you often get is tying your reputation to your art. Because it's a form of intellectual property and you invested time in creating this, we also see that it ought to defer to the individual's choice over whether they want to tie their own name to that, because they often get a PR benefit or at the very least feel validated in what they are doing. Therefore, regardless of societal impacts, I think that we have this right. I also think that there's a right to defend your identity as well. You often perceive your art as being about who you are, and therefore our added mechanism about being able to defend yourself and your being publicly bastardized is a form of self-defense to reclaim your identity within the public sphere. I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
Great. I think that's those remarks. I'll open the vote to close out the bench whenever you're ready.
Am I audible? I'm good. Cool. Devesh was right to say that opening half was severely lacking in imagination, and unfortunately, closing opposition is the same. So I'm going to do two things in this debate, right? Firstly, I'm going to explain how this affects the culture of writing, and secondly, what the most perverse harms in the status quo are that makes it so that this is comparatively much better. Because I think opening government does a very good job in proving to us why using a pseudonym can be very powerful at protecting certain writers. But what Devesh uniquely explains to you is why it is that when all works are done by pseudonyms, the shift in the culture and the production of writing is paramount, right? We explain why this fundamental shift in the culture of creating through writing enables far more people than just evading potential oppressive forces. Opening opposition tells us that, your name can sometimes be even powerful. But the issue here then becomes of how uncomparative their argumentation is. Because what Devesh uniquely explains to you is that the status quo is an example of why the pitfalls of having cults of personality is a result of the cultural and normative creations that individual authors have created and now need to necessarily use their names to break down. Much of the most powerful literature that every other team wants to talk about would already happen on government side, and that is why closing government wins this debate. So firstly then, how does this affect the culture of writing? All the responses to CO will be integrated, right? I think opening government tells us that detaching names enables minority writing. What Devesh uniquely brings here is that he explains to you why the focus on ideas actually structurally change. It changes not only who is able to write, but how you write and what you write about. It's about the idea that historically speaking, the dominance of white male writing has culturally changed how people perceive good writing. It's about how the cultural markers that shape what writing is has been influenced in a way that takes away the ability for minority writers to ever be inspired in the first place to be writing. It limits their ability historically to have ever written in the first place, right? Note that this debate is about the preference of worlds. We need to talk about not just what improvements that the 21st century has done to writing in terms of uplifting minority writers, but rather what the oppression has looked like in the past and why comparatively it would have been much better if everything was done anonymously, right? The first thing that we get from opening opposition is they tell us, you can take works and you can use them for yourselves on our side of the house. So this takes away from the benefits of creating important and revolutionary writing. The issue with this argument comes threefold. Firstly, note that this is not true, right? And I think both government teams do a pretty good job of explaining why your broad characteristics and even specific lived experiences are still going to be in the writing. What Devesh further explains to you is that given that more experiences are going to be included in writing, it no longer needs your name to be the one identifying marker that allows you to have legitimacy on this topic. The second thing to note here is that this is vastly uncomparative, right? And this notes, in this response to some of CO's criticism of our argumentation, right? The issue here is that in the status quo, there are vast swaths of historical examples of women and minority authors pitching an idea that is then popularized and attributed to men who have tried to steal this idea, right? For example, like how Susan Sontag pitched the idea of hermeneutics of suspicion far before Paul Ricoeur ever thought of it, but then this idea was stolen and recognized only because of Paul Ricoeur's race and his gender, right? The instance here that they need to compare themselves to is like the 2,000 years of good literature and important writing being taken away by people who otherwise would have been able to spread brilliant ideas all around the world. And this taking away has created both the chilling effect and the denial of the opportunity for these brilliant ideas to ever emerge in the future. The last thing I want to point out here is note that on our side, we can actually solve this problem, right? Because the culture changes. The culture is important here because the culture of writing emphasizes the inclusion of important preferences and identifiers into the work rather than just trying to assume that this is true through your name. Second thing that they then tell us is, but sometimes like your name can be very important, right? I think the above responses also respond to this, right? Because when you have lived experiences that people can relate to, it doesn't matter what name you reveal to the public, these identifiers will allow you to be able to make writing that people can relate to. Secondly, then, I want to address this idea about, from closing opposition about why they get rid of incentives for people to write, right? They tell us that you can't make money anymore, so a lot of important writing will never happen. Two reasons why this is not true. Firstly, yes, you can, right? They don't respond to any of Devesh's explanation as to how the ability to monetize and credit work will still happen, right? But it just happens considering the shift in culture. This might look like things like the anonymization in the publication process, where sure, the publicating house doesn't know who the author is, but they judge the works and can still sell these works on to give money to the authors. But even if that's not true, right? The purpose of the greatest writing, as Devesh explains to you, should not be profit and fame motivated in the first place. They then tell us, but then what about like people who won't be able to financially sustain themselves and won't be able to write on their side? I would say that the vast majority of minority writing was never created for profit on either side of the house, right? It's not like you can make mad bank by writing that type of writing that type of work anyways, right? So comparatively speaking, it's probably better on our side, at least, that there's more opportunity in an anonymized system. Secondly, they say, oh, but what about key pieces of scientific research that may be like world and game changing, right? The issue here is like, most of the scientific research that is done today is never done for the profit of the individual scientists, right? But the vast majority of blue sky research is done by universities with grants and funds. But secondly, and more importantly, right, even when it does come for profit like research, I think you just need to imagine what corporations will do to like, still be able to do this, right? They'll probably just anonymize the published research and still financially reward you within the company without ever needing to publish who your name is. Lastly, then they say, but there are like important things that people need to do revisionarily towards their work. I think firstly, you can still create clarifying works on both sides of the house. But secondly, even if that's not true, your work can be built on far easier by other people. Before I move on, I'll take an opening POI.
So yes, on both sides of the house, your identity is part of text. But under your side of the house, you only can be blunt about your identity, so that way people can know as much about the context of your work.
Okay.
Under our side, you can rest on the assumptions that people know about you, which increases both
that's
writing
15
and
seconds.
understanding.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't really see the marginal difference in change of like how much you can identify yourself. And I really don't think that there's going to be any decrease in quality if you're just blunt about your identity, right? So lastly then, what are the perverse harms of the status quo? Note that this is the argument that received the least amount of engagement from closing opposition, right? Devesh explains to you why the cults of personality and the unrelenting addiction and hunger for fame creates the deterioration of good writing. The only response we get is, oh, but there could also be famous pseudonyms. The issue here is that they don't respond to the nuance of Devesh's argument. And the biggest mechanistic change here is that you can't even know if the same pseudonym is the same person, which means that even if all of these works are published under the name Shakespeare, you don't know if they're the same person, which means that you have to judge every single work individually speaking, which means that you're far more likely to be able to write in a liberated and freed manner. The bottom line is, in the status quo, people with different viewpoints can't publish them, and they can't publish works that are diverse and unique to their lived experiences. On our side, you're much more likely to have created a historical culture that would have empowered this. I'm so proud to propose.
Great, and thank you for those remarks. Upwood, whenever you're ready.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. Any impact in this debate is contingent on a large amount of writing happening and a large amount of art happening. Naomi mechanizes while there'll be less, and that is what we win. There is a massive concession made in CG Whip. That I'm quoting verbatim CG Whip. The vast majority of minority writing is created not for profit, and that most research is done by blue sky stuff that has nothing to do with profit. The reason why both of these concessions are important is that maybe we would like to live in a world where everyone is perfectly moral and okay with writing deeply sensitive texts about their own experiences and fighting for social change with no benefit to themselves. But I just don't think people are that altruistic. I think the reason why people are willing to make broad sacrifices, write blogs about scientific issues, accept jobs at think tanks that pay nothing compared to the private sector, or become artists when there's a huge risk, is that they get to enjoy the fame, that they get to enjoy the fact that their work is tied to their reputation, and that they get validation and fame and social benefits. It is that cult of personality, if you want to call that from closing government, that artists enjoy. It is the fact that they get broadcast and they get fame. That is the reason why a whole set of work that is not adequately financially compensated is created in this world. But it is also the reason why unique financial opportunities emerge for artists in our world to go to in-person events, for academics to give interviews and get paid for it, for academics to give talks and get paid for it, and broadly for people to be able to monetize and get benefits in terms of the fame from the stuff that they write. The reason this is a logical prerequisite to all the rest of the debate is that the only principled element of freedom of speech that's remaining is just that, the thought crime impact from opening up. Well, if you're restricted from saying stuff, that's really bad. The problem is they never basically prove this. The motion is not magic, right? It's just a choice for people to write under a pseudonym. So all the same harms in terms of the government able to, actually secretly figure out who you are things that symmetrically apply, just that the government can, in theory, secretly find out who everyone is on Gov too. So what that means is that your right to freedom of speech is not being normatively restricted in some kind of special way. It's just that stuff is not coming out and there's no benefit of the discourse or marketplace of ideas. So those all end up being the things that we flip by pointing out that there's more writing. Because they're waving a lot and I'm going to get distracted, I'll call on OG now.
The POI you gave Devesh is correct. Pseudonyms still accumulate cults. This makes your argument that fame is necessary for making money marginal.
No, I mean, yes, obviously, you can still have a cult of personality that relates to your pseudonym, which is a reason why the Gov argument that says that you're going to get boxed into a specific kind of writing is symmetric. But you don't get to claim your cult of personality, right? Just that people interpret the same pseudonym as being the same writer, but you still don't get to say like, oh, that's me. So like that is such a fake tension. The next thing that I want to address then is why the impacts that we note in terms of flipping the stuff on like sexism and on social change are really important. The CG claim is that credibility will now be used as a metric. I disagree for two reasons. Number one, under pseudonyms, you're not actually going to be able to witness the actual identity and what the face looks like of the person. That means, though, that authors are still going to need to find ways to justify their credibility. The CG claim just asserts that they're going to do really good writing and everyone can recognize what really good writing looks like. Can everyone recognize what a really good scientific paper looks like? I don't know, because I'm not a field-specific expert. So the signals that people use are going to be like, I have a degree from X. But the problem is that is a net zero position on social change, because the people who have degrees, the people who have benefits in terms of being powerful in society are also going to be able to use their position of power, their social connections to get put in the newspaper in the first place, or to get the job at the think tank and do the publication, or to have the degree written down. So at best, CG demonstrates that there's no additional benefit in terms of people like reading like, well, this is a white guy, so I ought to believe him. And we can see like, in some cases that is likely to exist as a norm. But I just don't think that CG is successful in proving that they change that norm in a meaningful way. Because at best, the public is still able to see like, this person has a fancy degree, or they write for The Economist, but The Economist is still hiring white writers. The difference that Naomi highlights in her extension is that no one can call it out and no one can see it. So when there are differences in power dynamics, there is literally no ability to think, well, okay, well, this scientific paper is like a study on a given ethnic group, but it's written by a white guy. So I think that ultimately the ability to look at stuff and be like, well, what's the positionality of the author? Where are they coming from? Is heavily, heavily limited in GovWorlds when all writing is anonymous. The next thing that I then want to address is whether or not OG can win with their claim on freedom of speech and sort of weigh it out. So the OG claim is very simply reliant on one mechanism, that people are perceived to be less credible in the status quo when they write under a pseudonym. And as a result, that there would be some unique margin in terms of everyone doing this and thus freedom of speech existing. OO has a couple of good responses already. I think the JK Rowling example is kind of funny. But I think that the other thing that's important to push here is just that the ability to use a pseudonym is context dependent. And given that most authors are incentivized to either get the best reputation, get the most social change, or make the most money, there's going to be a selection effect whereby authors choose whether or not a pseudonym is useful based on whether or not they think the risks in terms of the reputation are large, or based, for example, on whether or not they think that the financial benefits are worth it. That means that selection effect means that A, we just get more writing because people can make that decision for themselves, and people who really care about reputation or really care about writing, but would still write really good academic work are still able to get in. And then the second thing that it just clarifies is that there's no real margin of freedom of speech, because the claim on OG is reliant on proving that people just distrust people who write under a pseudonym. But if you write under a pseudonym and you write like, I went to Harvard, but the pseudonym is still there, obviously there are mechanisms by which you can signal your credibility. And then obviously the fact that everyone does it doesn't mean that there's like any kind of safety in numbers compared to the status quo. I actually think that under an authoritarian regime, it is better in our world, because if you're writing under a pseudonym, you're the only one under the pseudonym. So the government doesn't suspect everyone of being like secret radicals or secret anti-government people. But in a world where everyone is writing under a pseudonym, presumably there are very large incentives for them to like surveil and look at your IP address. So I think we just flip that claim. No thanks to PO, I already took one. So why does the principle matter, and why does CG not responding to it really, really matter? The principle is not just a throwaway. The principle is a really important argument in the debate. And the underlying reason is that if you believe that anything is close in the debate, if you believe, for example, the margin on social change is very close, which it is, or if you believe that monetization is not perfectly mechanized, then the principle is obviously the deadlock breaker for all teams. The reason why this principle is important is that your identity and your self-expression is incredibly, incredibly important. The fact that you're putting your experiences, your work, your coding, your research into a piece of writing means that that writing is a reflection of specific things that you have done. The reason why you ought to have a right to gather the benefits from that work is very, very important. It is simply that this is labor that you directly put in. It's intellectual work that you drew into your writing, and that writing is a way of reflecting to others and providing benefits to others in terms of enjoying your work. But it means that people are not able to get reciprocal benefits. They can't monetize it. They can't do the talks. But I think most importantly, they don't get to feel that others are validating them. They don't get to look down and think, I'm happy because others are seeing my success and seeing my credibility and seeing and basically getting career benefits and life benefits from that reputation. That means for people who are writing for selfless reasons and caring about their reputation and caring about the work that they're doing for their community, they're disincentivized to write in the first place, flipping all the mechanization on freedom of speech and social change we oppose.
Great, thanks everyone for a really wonderful debate. I believe the panelists and myself are going to confer in here. So we'll see you when we announce results. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.